everyone. So we're in the great company of Daniel Belasco today, who is joining us live from Westchester. He's an art historian and executive director of the Untitled Foundation. He has been the curator at the Dorsky Museum at SUNY New Paltz, and also the curator at the Jewish Museum in New York. We had the great pleasure to hold the T-Space Residency final presentations at the grounds of the Untitled Foundation in Boyceville over the last 2 years for the final reviews. So it's great to see you again, Daniel. With no further ado, I'll pass on the microphone to you. And I just wanted to describe briefly the structure. Once the presentation is over, we will take some questions from the audience. So to our audience, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, as well as the chat function. So welcome.
Great. Thank you, Irini. It's really great to see you. And thanks, Susan and Celia and Stephen and everyone else at the T-Space. I'm going to speak mostly by sharing my screen. That's the beauty of being an art historian, is we get to share images with other folks and guide the conversation that way. I'll probably be talking for about 45 minutes and then take Q&A afterwards. So I think I'll just jump right into it. This is my first time doing a Zoom lecture. So if there are any glitches, it's all on me, though I've really learned to appreciate the medium in the last few months. So as Irini mentioned, this is the third year that I've had the pleasure of working with T-Space and getting to know the architectural fellows. This is an image from 2 years ago, 2018, the final presentation in the Al Held studio, a former dairy barn in Boyceville, the Catskill Mountains. And the synergy between Held's painting and the work by the architects is really palpable and very visible here, and it certainly was at the time as well. There are two later paintings by Held on the wall, as well as some of the designs by one of the fellows presenting her work. So I'm sorry we're not able to meet in person this year. I was looking forward to taking the show on the road and meeting everyone in Rhinebeck, but fingers crossed we'll be able to do it next summer. So the question of Al Held and architecture is a really rich one, and there are different avenues to approach it. On one direction, we have the later work by Held, where he was looking at a lot of Italian Renaissance painting and was very interested in the perspectival systems and the architecture that was represented in the work by Piero della Francesca and others. This is a print from 1994 that Held titled Embarcadero, because he made the print at Crown Point Press in San Francisco at the same time when the Embarcadero freeway was being torn down. Held had a personal relationship to this freeway because as a young man in the 50s, he was responsible, of course, partially for building the freeway. He was trained as a carpenter, so he would build molds for concrete, which was then poured to build the freeway around 1955, 56. So you can see very overt architectural structures and the sense of post and lintel design in this type of work by Held. But I would say more interestingly and more to the point for this lecture is Held's more abstract geometrical work, especially from the later 60s and throughout the 70s, when there was a real synergy between Held and architects. Held was looking at their work, they were looking at his work, and there were just a lot of significant overlaps. The best documented study or case study we have for this is I. M. Pei. This is a cover of a study of his work from 2000. And on the background behind him, as you can see, is a Held painting from 1974 entitled Compass Rose, which Pei hung in his New York office from 1977 when he purchased it to his death. And I've never personally visited the Pei office, but I know those people who worked there and those people who visited him understood that this played a very significant role in the decor, but also the conceptual inspiration that Pei surrounded himself with. One of the things I enjoy about working at an artist foundation is that we not only do we have the work of Held to look at and to research, but we're surrounded by his papers, his letters, correspondence, and we're fortunate to be on his property as well. So a tantalizing document that shows the relationship, again, between Pei and Held is this very brief letter from '95, and I'll read it to you. Of all the nice letters I've received on the Louvre, yours means the most to me. You know that I respect you as an artist and that your opinion is of special value to me. So for art historians, this is catnip. This gets at, having some kind of like evidence of a relationship between artists and designers in different fields, looking at each other's work, just can trigger a whole lot of interpretive possibilities. So some of what this talk is trying to do is try to fill out all of what is unsaid, possibly in this letter. So I just want to take a few decades back, present a brief intro to Al, where he was from, and also to introduce the theme of transformations of consciousness, which is something that actually really relates very strongly to Held's work. He was born in Brooklyn in 1928 to a working class immigrant family. They were largely Marxists and very allied with the workers' movement. And he, as a child, was an undiagnosed dyslexic. So he struggled at school, dropped out when he was 17, and joined the US Navy as soon as he could, which was right after the end of World War II. He served for 2 years on the boats that were servicing submarines, did deep sea diving and other interesting projects. And it was there, interestingly enough, that Held started to read. And the first book that he has said that he read was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, which, as some of you might know, is about an architect. Also, it introduces her own particular political theories, but the main narrative is about an architect. So I think that's another tantalizing clue that he was interested in larger issues around space and politics and culture through architecture. He came back to New York in '47 after 2 years and didn't quite know what to do with himself. He was living at home at the Bronx at the time. And he ended up finding his way to Pete Seeger's house in the Greenwich Village. Pete Seeger, a well-known folk singer, left-wing activist, and real kind of spiritual leader for a lot of folks. Instrumental in bringing a revival of the folk music scene, square dancing, and really an advocate for integration and freedom. And so Held started to become active in May Day parades, May Day floats, and then, I don't know if this is blocked by the stack of our videos on the right, but there's a poster for the Henry Wallace campaign. There's an interesting footnote to history, but Henry Wallace was the vice president under FDR in the 40s. And then he ran for president as a third party candidate in 1948 under the Progressive Party. And he ran a anti-racist, anti-colonialist campaign, attracted a lot of excitement among artists and musicians, including Held, who was very involved in trying to get out the vote in New York City. But of course, ultimately, as you can imagine, was not successful in the campaign. Held at this time started to meet artists, became interested in the power of art to change minds. and aspired to become a social realist painter. He started studying at the Art Students League. These are some early sketches. I'm particularly interested in his drive for discovering geometry and unearthing kind of deeper structures and organizations within the human body, such as these ovals on the head on the left, or the torso of the female on the right. He aspired to, as I said, be a social realist painter and a muralist. He had very big ambitions. He wanted to reach a wide audience. His hero at the time was David Alfaro Siqueiros, one of the big three of Mexican muralism. And at the time, Siqueiros was teaching in a school in San Miguel de Allende and working on a large mural. And hordes of American GIs were able to use the GI Bill and study with Siqueiros in Mexico, and Held hoped to be able to do that. But Siqueiros, as an ardent communist, got into a fight with the school administration. They fired him. The US government caught wind of it, and they ended the accreditation for this particular school. So Held, because he had not a lot of money, was not able to travel to Mexico. He needed to go to a school where he could use his GI Bill, went to Paris instead. His only contacts there initially were folks in the French Communist Party. So his first few months in Paris, arriving as a aspiring social realist painter and muralist, was to pick up where he left off and get active in May Day parades and protest American imperialism, this time in alliance with the French Communist Party. And he studied with at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, which was very popular for young American and international students. And this is where Held had a transformation, a revelation, if you will, in his words, or epiphany, where he decided that Jackson Pollock was the true social realist, and his work, as you can see on the right, was more accurate in depicting the mood, the climate, the social reality, the angst, the fear that of the early 1950s, with the rise of the atomic bomb, McCarthyism in the United States. So at this point, Held switched from being a figural painter to becoming an abstract painter. He didn't want to mimic Pollock, and no one could anyway. So his idea was to somehow marry or hybrid the structure of Mondrian, or the objectivity of Mondrian, and the subjectivity of Pollock. And in a way, that became a metaphor for his life's work following this revelation in the early 50s. He had his first show in Paris, and this is a postcard. So it's a piece of, it's an ephemera, but it does articulate the way Held was able to isolate and control Pollock's technique and use it for his own ends. I've always been quite intrigued by not only the work that Held did when he was in Paris and the other artists that he met, but the art that he was looking at. And we're relying almost entirely on oral histories to understand what he saw in Paris and what excited him and what he might have taken back with him in his memory bank to New York. One of the artists who loomed large in Paris at the time was Léger, obviously a major figure of the School of Paris and Cubism in the early 20th century. He ran a school which was accredited by the US government. A lot of American students studied with Léger, including Sam Francis, who became a good friend of Held. Held, though, in one of those curious cases of reverse psychology, even though he loved Léger's work, he kind of rejected the opportunity to study with him. I think it was too close. He needed to create some distance. But he did claim that he went to an opening of Léger in Paris and did shake his hand. And it was for this body of work called The Builders or The Constructors. And if we separate out and kind of imagine these figures disappearing, we're left with the post and lintel architecture of the girders that are floating in space, that have an architectural adjacent atmosphere that I think Held returned to again and again in his own work. He also spent a great deal of time in the Louvre, in the Grand Salon, and he loved this painting in particular, the Raft of the Medusa. Certainly a overly dramatic, overly romantic depiction. That type of mood was not something that he particularly wanted to capture, but he loved the movement of the painting. He loved the narrative unfolding across both, horizontally and vertically across the painting. I think that sense of movement and time in a painting is a value that Held brought into his work. He also traveled to Spain. He took these art pilgrimages. Seeing Las Meninas in the Prado is a high point for pretty much anyone who's interested in Western painting. And this one resonates also very strongly with Held's later work. His interest in perspectives, multiple perspectives, and even contradictory perspectival systems. Also, the possibility of using light to create a sense of deep space and recession and interior volume. We see that in a lot of Held's later work. So I'm now skipping 10 years. He went through a whole abstract expressionist phase. Very important. That's where he made his name initially in New York. Excuse me. But more related to the topic at hand is the body of work that starts with the letter paintings. At this point, Held was very focused on specificity. He wanted to create images that were generic in form, and here he looked at letters of the Roman alphabet, such as the X and the T, but to continue to work them and rework them, shifting the contours, slightly changing the perspective, cropping in different locations, until he was able to create a real tension in the image, which he felt gave it a individuality or a specificity. And he was also interested in figuring out how these different masses could be aligned either horizontally or vertically on a single painting, but they could exist in separate spaces. So this idea of extending space, I mean, he's struggling within the four corners of the canvas, but how can he bust beyond that? And you could do it through this idea of extended space, also sheerly large scale. So as we recall, there was this dream that Held had of being a social realist painter and muralist, transforming the mind of the viewer, of the audience, through painting and meeting the public directly in space. As far as I can tell, the first time that Held tried to attain a public commission was in 1964 at there's a construction at New York University of a new building, Warren Weaver Hall, which most famously hosts the mathematics department. The architect is John A. Warner of Burns, Tone, and Lund. And I'm not an architectural critic, so forgive me if I'm misspeaking or if anyone vehemently disagrees with me, but to my eye, this seems to be a fairly generic mid-60s building that uses the language of the international style and emergent brutalism without giving it too much poetry or personality. But it was an opportunity for Held to present a mural, and he was one of 7 artists invited to share a mural sketch. It was this one, that idea of extended space and inserting different geometric forms on a singular plane, but that would somehow exist in a different spatial dimension, was an idea that he then explored horizontally here. And you could also see the cropped geometric figures. He was not selected for this commission, but he did end up painting his own version of it. It doesn't look as big in this image, but in fact, it's 56 feet long on 7 panels. This is an installation view at the Kunsthal Basel, where Held was in a group show. It's called Greek Garden. And the scale of Held's work became immense, bigger than his New York studio at the time could handle. This was the biggest possible painting that he could make, but he wanted to paint bigger than this. And so he bought the farm in Boyceville. This is a photo from the winter of '65 when he first purchased it with the original paint job. You can see those mountain Catskills in the background. And the 2 silos, the building right in the center, they're attached on the north end of the large painting studio, which we saw an interior of earlier. And here's the interior as it looked. And the geometrical structures are beautiful. He felt that it was a cathedral, and it became a very inspiring space for him. He also, I think, understood this as a vernacular geometric structure. And because of Held's interest in using found geometries, there's always this debate about Picasso versus Matisse, and who's the inventor of form and who's the inventor of space. And so Held was much more on the Matisseian side of the equation. He was definitely more of an interest in form and space and relation than being an inventor of form. And he was happy to borrow existing forms, I think in the same way that he was happy to respond to this existing architectural space for his own studio. So another piece of this puzzle of Held and architecture is Held's time at Yale. He was first a visiting critic and then a adjunct professor of painting at the Yale School of Art and Architecture from '63 to 1980. So I'm showing you an image that should be familiar to all of you. Paul Rudolph's new at the time in the '60s art and architecture building, which though completed in '64 officially, the students began moving in '63, which is around the same time that Held started teaching there. I'm not sure exactly why, but it wasn't until about '67 that the painting students started complaining about the building. Maybe the spirit of activism of the '60s finally got to the Yale students, and there's a detail on the screen of an article in the Yale Daily News about the students protesting. The painting grad students in particular, who were Held students, objected to the fact that their studios were the same size as the architects' studios, and they felt that the architects just needed a table and they could roll up their designs and walk out the door. But students in the late '60s needed much larger studios. The scale of art had grown significantly, and that there was this inherent bias in the architecture of the building against painting students. And Held was one of the 4 professors who signed on to a protest letter that was also, I think, 49 of the 53 graduate painting students were protests. So as much as Held wanted to collaborate with architects, there was also sometimes an inherent tension between painting students and architects in terms of the control of space, the design of space, the usage of space. Held, and I'm not sure exactly to what extent, but he was involved in larger conversations in the Yale School of Art and Architecture about contemporary architectural theory. He did teach a seminar called Art and the Environment in the 1965 to '66 school year. He did sit on panels with Bernard Rudofsky. He did discuss the writings of Venturi and Scully, though I'm not sure if he had personal interactions with them. But just to boil down the ideas of Rudofsky's idea of vernacular architecture and geometry, Venturi's notion of architecture as yes and, as an additive process, not a reductive process, and Scully's notion of contextualism, all formulated in this time in the mid-60s, I think were important for Held and gave him some fuel for going beyond his studio and working in more public spaces with architects. He also became quite interested in scale, and in fact became a sort of a thought leader around issues of scale and abstract painting. So this is one of the landmarks of the development of minimalist ideals and theories in New York in the mid-60s. A massive Olmec sculpture was displayed in front of the Seagram building in New York City on Park Avenue for about 7 weeks prior to its movement to the Mexican pavilion at the World's Fair in Queens. And the New York artists just kind of went gaga for this. They just loved the size, the intensity, the monolithic quality of this work, how an ancient sculpture could hold its own in one of the great canyons of, American modernism, Park Avenue at the time. You can see the Lever building across the street, and Mies van der Rohe's building, of course, was the background on the right. I think this gave artists and painters and sculptors confidence that, in fact, they could create work in public space that wouldn't be 50 stories tall, but actually could hold the eye, and through the use of powerful scale could actually create a space for artists within an urban environment. So that painting we saw earlier, Greek Garden, was used as an illustration in an article on this question of scale in an Art Forum magazine in October 1967. The idea of scale is important because when you're an abstract painter and you're just painting bigger and bigger and bigger, how do you prevent your work from just becoming decorative or background or simply wallpaper? And for Held, he realized that the issue really was content. How can you bring content into abstract painting? Of course, many abstract painters brought spiritual content into their work, or personal content, but Held was after something else. And it took him, I think, a while to really formulate what that content was. Some of his ideas were used around scale, were used for an exhibition at the Corcoran in Washington, D.C. called Scale as Content, around the same time, the fall of '67. And one of Held's good friends was the sculptor Ronald Bladen, who constructed his massive X wooden sculpture, which on the right you can see in the Corcoran, on the left it's on construction in on Held's property in Boyceville, outside of his wife at the time, Sylvia Stone's drawing studio. And you can see Sylvia in the blue blouse at the bottom of that image, and Bladen is shirtless up at the top. So now I just want to touch upon some of the actual collaborations between Held and architects, and to bring us a little bit more closely to what Held was doing and how he was trying to take some of these ideas around scale and mass and the environment, bring that into his work when he really had the opportunity to create projects for public space. His first commission was remarkably from Gropius for the largest building that I think he built west in the States, west of New York, in Shaker Heights, Ohio. It was completed in '68, and Held was hired to create one mural. Held was so excited that he created two. This is the first, called The Eye. It's in the lobby. It's a hard to photograph, in part because the way the building is created, there's a lower level entrance, and then you walk up a flight of stairs to an upper level lobby, and then that's where the painting is. And the bottom of the painting is about 9 feet above the ground. And Held was very interested in actual space or site specificity. He didn't want to just make his painting and then hope it looked good in the site for which it was commissioned. So with the luxury of his big barn, he was able to rig a support where the painting was roughly 9 feet above the ground, so he could really understand how it would be experienced by the viewer in Gropius's space. And the left is the eye, and then on the right we see the partner painting, which appeared on the other end of the lobby, called the We. And these are very late in Held's letter painting series, where he was finishing up exploring his ideas of monolithic forms, specific geometries, and singular, very planar objects on space. So now looking into Pei, who's our best case, our best documented case in relationship between Held and architecture. The Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, was Pei's first museum commission. It's a concrete structure. This, I think, was taken around the time of its opening in '68 with a Henry Moore sculpture at the center. It's a series of concrete boxes that are floating. And as you can see from some of the initial plans and schematics, there's a sense of centrifugal force around them too, that they're these solid shapes, but they're held in this dynamic tension. And Pei had the opportunity to select the work of 3 artists whose paintings would be purchased by the museum and displayed in the lobby, the central lobby space at the time of the museum's opening. So Held was one of the 3 artists who was selected, and this was the painting that was purchased by the museum. It was an early work in Held's black and white series. So Held had one of these transformations of consciousness to go from the flat planar forms of the letter paintings to the introduction of volume and space, 3-dimensionality, into the black and white paintings, and of course restricting his palette to only black and white allowed him to really focus on those questions of geometry and perspective. At this point, he was inspired by the idea of multiplicity and simultaneity, and how can a single image contain so many realities at once. None of this is possible within sort of actual life, but it exists as a imaginary structure. I'm sorry if you hear a lawnmower in the background. It's the problems of suburban life, but I'll continue. So this is the interior of the Pei building around the time that it opened. And I'll move this. I don't know if this helps everyone, but you can see Held's painting on the far right. That's just the best installation shot that I have that at least shows the central staircase alongside where Held's painting was. And if you look up at the top of the image, you also see this concrete coffered ceiling. So at the opening, Held said that he and Pei had a long conversation about light. And Held, again, this is Held's retelling of the story, was surprised that even though there was no structure above this particular gallery or this lobby, it was just, above the ceiling was sky. He didn't understand why Pei didn't have skylights. For Held, natural light was the ideal way to see and experience paintings and art. And he felt that Pei had just, from his perspective as an artist, had missed the opportunity to bring light into the space. So that may or may not have had an impact on Pei's next big museum project. Trying to advance here. Oops, sorry. The National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Added an East Building. Commissioned Pay in '68, sort of the same time that he was finishing up the Everson Museum. And, sorry, here we go. So some initial sketches of Pay's solution to the challenges of the site. The image on the left in the red crayon or the red pencil shows his initial breakthrough for the site plan. It was this oblong rectangular form, only 2 right angles, it was polygon shape that was difficult to put a single mass on. So Pay's solution was to have 2 triangular forms to work on some tension between those 2 triangular shapes. And then from the site, 2-dimensionally, realize that obviously up in 3 dimensions, using the triangle as a mass, kind of guiding geometry. But supposedly, or not supposedly, but as we can see on the left, the initial plan for the lobby was to also have a similar concrete ceiling as Pay used in the Everson Museum. But perhaps because of his conversation with Held, or I would think multiple conversations, I'm sure Pay was working, in a collaborative environment. And so you can never really attribute anything to one reason, but perhaps Held's voice did play a role in Pay ultimately getting rid of the concrete ceiling and going for a crystalline glass atrium, which is now beloved public space within Washington, D.C., and certainly the signature element of the experience of the National Gallery. And going back to this idea of geometry as a generative form, I think that's a relationship that both Held and Pay really shared in common. And this again is the painting that Pay owned. So the movement of space, the overlapping of geometric shapes, the idea that one's experiences and perspectives can change through time are, I think, shared by both artist and architect. I'll quickly just jump through a couple of other architectural commissions. Not as exciting as Pay's buildings. Harrison's work is obviously fascinating from a formal sculptural point of view, but Held was just given effectively a hallway in the lower lobby and used it to really instill time into the work. There's a 90-foot mural. Held smartly realized that few people were going to actually come down and frontally contemplate his painting, and then most people would just be walking alongside of it. So he choreographed this unfolding of geometric shapes across the canvas, inspired by Japanese screens, where you'd have vignettes that would unfold across the screen in time. Here's a detail of one of the sections in the studio. Held used a similar strategy in an even larger commission for a Social Security building in Philadelphia. There were 2 90-foot paintings. This is one of them. And you can see there's these thicker black lines of a very elongated rectangular form run throughout almost the entire picture plane of this painting. So I think it was an interesting way for him to knit together the individual vignettes of the shapes passing forwards and backwards, but also since a larger structure. And here's the image in his studio in Brooklyn. So a couple of other points to touch upon, other aspects of this body of work from the 1970s, and his interest in the tools of architecture. he started to use architectural stencils and simply color in or draw in shapes from the stencils onto the paper where he had laid out his other more familiar, larger geometric shapes. And once again, it's this tension between what the picture plane is and that sense of space. And here Held continued to defy what the practices of proper modernist painting were, at least termed by Clement Greenberg and the formalist school, which was still largely dominant within painting in the 60s and 70s, where painting had to be flat, it had to be one shot, optical, you take in the whole in a moment. Held resist that and insisted on complexity and contradiction in his work. Here's one of the last paintings of the black and white series, where the picture plane is completely fragmented and there's multiple dimensions. And finally, he started to put color into the work through his drawings. And he felt that as he wanted to put more and more into the paintings, he needed to have color to further refine the form so they wouldn't all blur into one. For him, there were sort of watchwords. He never wanted the work to become decorative, and he never wanted to become a field. And so to avoid that, color ultimately allowed him to bring in even more space. So it's a whole other conversation to talk about how Held's later work may relate to architecture, but one little last kind of direct connection is by the firm Kieran Timberlake, best known perhaps right now for having designed the US Embassy in London. They started out very early, meeting Held in the US American Academy in Rome, and they saw the work that Held was doing at the time, where he was inspired more and more by Italian Renaissance painting and creating these imaginary structures. And this single central axis with radiating forms became important for at least this one project by Kieran Timberlake at a small college in Philadelphia. And you can see how those columns and the beams are a pretty literal translation of a Held painting. And this is not something that they really continued the rest of their career, but I think it was a way for them to start establishing their own position within modernism, or really postmodernism, while retaining an attention to geometry. So finally, just the last thought about Held and the theme that I know will be exploring during the residency of transformation of consciousness. He taught drawing and painting at Yale, as I said, for nearly 2 decades. One of the stories that he always told was about, he continually fought this battle within Yale about how to teach drawing, and that, largely drawing was taught as a representational system, that you would draw what you see. His position was that drawing was, in fact, a conceptual system, and that drawing could be anything, and that it didn't have to be connected to what the eye sees, but what the mind sees. And the challenge that he brought to his students was to, go up on a hill and to, at the time of the sun setting, and to paint, to draw the curvature of the earth, to draw what they see. And so, of course, you see maybe a flat horizon, but we know that the earth is curved. So he wanted that paradox, that tension between what we see versus what we know, to both be at play in his paintings. And often the first step was a transformation of consciousness, which I think is also rooted in his Marxist family background. So I'll conclude my remarks right there. And I am interested in any questions that you might have about either Held in general or some of the works that I discussed in this presentation or the foundation or whatever, wherever you want to go with this is fine with me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel.
This has been, thank you for a very thorough presentation, very detailed, which I really think captures the dance between art and architecture and the exploration of space, physically and through the canvas, the exploration of depth and expansion. And I think that the series of slides that we saw really capture this dialogue, or the dialectics between the space that the art is contained within and the space that it tries to explore in the case of Al-Held. There are some questions coming in from the audience, along with thanking you. There is about 70 people participating, and we want to give everybody some time to understand, think, and ask. I will take one question from Jean Palette, wondering if Held having any contact with Peter Eisenman, or perhaps Peter Eisenman influencing Held, perhaps?
Not that I know of. One of the challenges of doing this kind of biographical research and the interactions with artists is that you're left with what documents do we have? And so Held was not one of those artists who kept detailed date books or diaries. He did not have a very active correspondence. So unfortunately, our knowledge is fairly fragmentary. And so a lot of it's really word of mouth. It's an oral history, both from Held and from those who knew him well. So we're still trying to piece that together. So certainly maybe some of the formal connections can be observed between the work, and Held was an active participant in the origins of postmodernism within architecture. I think he might have been one of the first artists to be called postmodern in Art News in 1967. So there's tantalizing information, but it remains to be known how broadly he interacted.
Another question from Lauren Henking. Considering how important space was to Al-Held and site specificity, is it difficult to navigate how his works are shown now without his input on exactly how they're exhibited?
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. He certainly had strong ideas about, we had two different bodies of work also. We had like the works for galleries, which have sort of an autonomous nature to them, and then the site-specific works. So some of his works have the power of site specificity and seem to be commissioned. So his painting that was in Pei's office was called a mural by a lot of people. It seemed so perfect for its location that writers assumed it was painted for that spot. In fact, it wasn't. Pei purchased it from the Andre Emmerich Gallery out of an exhibition. So anyway, I think your question about, what do we do as a foundation, or as anyone who has to continue forth the legacy of an artist who is no longer with us, you just rely on past practices as much as possible, and you try to adhere to what the artist would have wanted to have happened. And sometimes we have a lot of specific information about that, and sometimes we just have to use a gut feeling. But also, art changes, environment changes, and every exhibition is really site specific. And so ultimately you just want the work to look as good as possible. So if the painting end up being hung a little bit higher than Held would have liked it, but that just best suits that particular location, then we feel we have an argument to make for it.
Daniel, another question from Brian Wallace. You noted there was a concern on Held's part about getting too decorative or too field-like. Is there a difference between the two that you would help us understand Held's sense of architecture, space, or painting?
Yeah, I think that formally for Held, a field was, he was thinking about sort of like a blank space, something that was, you know, like the back where the background would become the foreground. Whereas I think decorative was more of a kind of interpretive response to it. And of course, times have changed, and decorative used to be a dirty word for artists, especially those who came up through abstract expressionism, and as Held did. So I think we have more sophisticated understanding of decoration, and that there is real content in decoration as well, or what might have been construed in the past as decoration. So I think for Held, it was in some ways using the language of his time to describe his work, but I think he also was trying to articulate a formal position and putting in the content that he wanted to have, because I think he didn't, you know, the content that he associated with decorative was not content that he particularly valued at that time.
I would love to open up the questions from our residents. Munher?
Yeah, so it seems like Held had a lot of influence from the places he was traveling and the people and the time he was interacting with. And I think from my observation of his work, it seemed like he was kind of fighting with himself, trying to simplify the complexity within and with his surrounding. Could you speak a bit about that? Because he was using a lot of primitive forms to kind of express himself. So how did that relate to himself and his progression through his career?
Yeah, that's a really great question. He was very aware that for him, painting was a continual struggle. And a lot of it is boiled down to his practice itself. And that's not something I touched on yet, but he continually painted and repainted his images. He never sketched and then scaled up a sketch to the size of a painting, nor did he rely on projectors or other means to transfer images. For him, he had to work in actual scale, and he would paint and repaint and just continue to work the contours. What he was often after wasn't even an image as much as a sensation, something that he would say that he could taste or he could smell. There was a real physicality to the work. And that runs throughout the paintings, whether it was those colorful letter paintings of the 60s or the black and white paintings of the 70s. He continually had to rework the image. I think he didn't know what he wanted until he found it. And so I think that's tension is within his painting process. And then I think he was trying to find imagery that also would express that uncertainty. For him, you know, certainly how he ended up later in his work, there's this idea of multiple truths and multiple realities that we live in the world, that there's conflicting worldviews and that there's constant conflict. And how can he, as an individual who's centered within himself, still create a single image that could both represent these contradictions and these paradoxes, while also still have a sense of being a singular, unified structure. So that was kind of what he was always after in his work.
I would like to follow up with a question about light. This is particularly important here for the residency. We do explore natural light, and we're very interested in the movement of light through space. So I was curious about, you mentioned that he insisted upon naturally lit spaces. How do you think he may explore that? Is he exploring that through his art, or do those flat, solid colors talk about light?
the later geometric work from 74-ish to 78, he was trying to bring light into the painting through different weights of line. He also brought in different tools. So he's using tape a lot more. So he would get tape that was 1/16 of an inch and as thin as that, and then other tape that might be 2 inches wide. And by not just exploring perspective, but also by lightening the lines, he tried to like bring in more light into the painting. And then once he switched to color, I think one of the reasons he did that was because he wanted to make light more of a formal consideration. And there's not shadow in his work, but there's a lot of light. And so you see that much more with the color paintings. And by the time you get into the 90s, there's these very dramatic, dark paintings with these spots of light in other locations. It's about as romantic as you'll see Held ever getting.
That's beautiful. Color is light, so that even in the absence of shadow, that does speak to it. That's beautiful. Another question from Michael Anthony Kindica. Based on my observation, the relationship of art held and architecture pay at some point relies on phenomenology. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, and could you talk more about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very astute observation. And Merleau-Ponty and structuralism was a watchword for Held in the 60s as he started to formulate a lot of these ideas. And so he was very much interested in the embodiment of vision. And this is one of his fights that he had with Greenberg, where, Greenberg seemed to have like a disembodied sense of vision, whereas Held wanted to constantly anchor our vision in our bodies and engage the other senses. And the fourth dimension, which is time, also became a crucial element of Held's work in the black and white period. So yeah, so absolutely phenomenology was crucial.
If there is any other concluding comments or remarks from the residents or the audience, you're very welcome.
So I just want to say that I really thank you again for the opportunity, and the Held Foundation is, we're reopening, and, if anyone's interested in visiting, they should get in touch with me. My email or contact information is on the Al Held Foundation website. So
can you, what is the website? We can type it into the chat bar here so people know where to look.
Yeah.
Can you type it directly into the chat?
Sure, it's alheldfoundation.org. See if I spelled it correctly. Yeah. So it's great to meet everyone in the virtual space. But if anyone would like to come visit or bring a group, we're trying to reopen, and the fall may be good and the spring will be even better. So, so please, you're welcome to come visit. It's a beautiful property and inspiring studios.